Hello there, and welcome once more to the History of Comics. My name is Paulo, and today I decided to share some of the items that led me to become a serious comic book fan and a serious collector. I was supposed to do this with a friend of mine, but he had a family thing, so he was not available. He grew up reading the same comics as I did, and is mostly a fan of Marvel and DC, of what was published around here in Portugal in the 1980s. Now, uh, I didn't start reading comics in English until I was about 16. I could have started earlier, but we had a chronology that I liked following, and the market conditions. Uh, Only when the market conditions deteriorated was when I started reading in English. So I have a lot of comics that were published in Portuguese. Most of them are from Brazil. Superheroes had to be imported from Brazil into Portugal. We had occasional forays into American comic book publishing, but they usually were either not serious or not treated with quality, or would eventually die down. So during the 80s, in the 90s, the best way to get comic books was if we decided to import them from Brazil, and then we would pick them up. Now, I started reading comics when I was 4, and the best way to get into comics was by reading Disney comics. Disney are very popular in Europe, much more than they've been for decades in the United States, and we have comics that have never been seen by Americans because they were produced in Italy or Sweden or sometimes even in Brazil. Original stories that were produced for the local market or even for the European market in general. And like everyone who started reading comics in the 1980s in Portugal, I started with Disney. So for a couple of years, it was normal. I would go with my dad to the gas station. He would pick up his newspaper, and I would bug him into buying me a comic. Now, I don't have any of them anymore for various reasons. First, when I was younger, my mom would throw away my comics. It happened everywhere. Uh, After a while, when I was about 9, 10, my mom was not throwing away the comics, but because I was almost 10, I decided, oh, I'm not going to read Disney anymore. These are for kids. And I let my sister have them, but she didn't keep them, so they were thrown away again. And for a while, I didn't have any Disney comics in my collection, which is actually kind of a shame, because now that I'm older, I can actually appreciate how much work went into those stories. And so I kind of miss them. They're not kept in the same way as the superhero comics were, so they're kind of hard to track down if you're looking for specific issues. Of course, the good thing about Disney is that you could read one story and you'd understand everything, and you didn't need to read another story. That was they were always available. But still, after a while, we had some special editions that allowed me to pick up what we had. So they're not exactly the same stories that I read as a kid, but they ended up becoming some of my favorite items in my collection. So we had these special editions that were published around 2003, 2004. The first one, the Portuguese edition of the Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. This is a thick book, or over 300 pages, and as you can see, they're smaller than the comic books you have over there in the United States. That's because we have this type of spinner racks that were made specifically for comics, and they were sort of what's the size be? Uh, 6 by 4 inches, I guess. So they were smaller, and they were a little bigger than digest size, and they had a lot more pages than a regular American comic book. It was usual to have comics which were 64 or 80 pages, sometimes even 100, and there were special editions that were over 120 pages. And if we had a big if we had a big trip, we'd rather buy one of those because it would entertain us for a couple of hours and had loads of stories, usually sometimes in the same theme and sometimes just completely different, but with a boatload of characters. When I decided to buy the Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, this is by Don Rosa, who is considered the best post Carl Barks writer and artist. He follows Barks very closely, both in his art style, but also in the themes that he writes in his stories. When he wrote this, he wanted to bring some chronological order or in the chronological origin to the roots of the Duck family. It's kind of hot here. It was over 100 degrees during the day, so it's still hot and I'm sweating. And Rosa based himself on the original Barks stories to tell this. Let's see if I can open this up without damaging it. Okay. This was Scrooge McDuck early when he was very young, and in the story he already met an ancestor of Gyro Gearloose, was the ancestors of the Beagle Boys. Stories are very good, and they're full of action in the typical Disney fashion. Also with lots of. Rosa is not afraid to do an eight panel grid, but he'll also bring up some artwork if he's into it. Unfortunately, not everything was roses. There were a couple of stories that they're no longer considered politically correct nowadays, and Rosa had to take care of them in a incorporated in a different fashion, in a way that portrays Scrooge McDuck as a not very likable character, unfortunately. Like this one, when he finally goes to Alaska, and he makes a woman that was interested in a gold digger. He makes a gold digger work for him. It was essentially slave labor. There's a couple stories here where he also met John Rockerduck's father. In the European comics, it's not Flintheart Glomgold, but rather John Rockerduck, who is Scrooge's main opponent. Here's that story. Right. In the story, Scrooge meets a witch doctor, and he gets swindled, and as revenge, he destroys the witch doctor's village. So this is one of the stories that Rosa felt that he had to tell, but does not portray Scrooge in a very positive light. The last story in here is a take on Citizen Kane. which is how Scrooge met his nephew, Donald Duck, who is the son of his youngest sister. There is an actual family tree for the Duck family. So if you're wondering why they're all nephews, turns out there are actual parents in the family. Here are a few of the original covers that appeared. Now, some of the stories that I may have read, but I no longer remember, are published here. This is one of the volumes that features Carl Barks' original stories. And whenever we bought a Disney comic, we didn't know what we were going to get. The cover usually didn't even portray the story. It was mostly a theme for the issue. But Carl Barks was either recognizable or at least left his mark in a way that he had a range of imitators. There were a lot of stories that put Donald and his nephews not in the Old West, but in frontier towns that would still exist in a manner similar to the Old West, even as far as the 1930s or 40s. Which basically allowed Barks to put the Ducks in lots of adventures, not only inside the United States, but sometimes when they went out with Uncle Scrooge, they would visit faraway lands in Africa and Asia. Here's another story with Donald's lucky cousin, Gladstone Gander, who I hated, or I love to hate. And this one is a story with Grandma Duck. These are characters that I grew up with that I read when I was starting out as a comic book reader when I was about 5 or 6 years old. But there were a couple of others, and I want to show the Phantom. Now, the Phantom I didn't usually buy as comic books, but he appeared in the same newspaper that my dad used to buy in the 1980s through the first half of the 90s, and I really enjoyed those stories. Great art by Cy Berry, and the stories were usually interesting. They had a modern setting, but they kept all the adventure from the old times that were regular here. So in this comic here, I have some of Cy Berry's early stories. They kind of still look like Bill Lignante or Wilson McQuire, which was not an artist I was fond of. On this comic in particular, the reproduction was terrible. So let's see what I can do here. Okay. So these are the type of Phantom stories that I used to read with the Bendar alongside him, and his adopted son Rex had already debuted. Here you go. Which was a fun part. I remember the Phantom's wedding to Diana Palmer, as well as the birth of the nephews. But I kind of preferred Rex because he was a kid of 8, 9, 10 growing up in the jungle, and he would get into mischief. And the twins were younger at the time, and they were not as fun. Here's another fantasy story. Piracy was a common thing throughout the decades up to the 1960s, before the story started caring more about exploitation of Africa. Here you go, better reproduction here. You can see the phantom better. In these stories, the I'm not sure you can see, but the lettering was done in typeset. It was terrible. There were a lot of small publishers that ran comic book strips like The Phantom, Flash Gordon, Mandrake, Tarzan by Tarzan and Prince Valiant by Hal Foster were a couple of favorites. I also liked the British comic book strip Garth, and having the possibility of seeing these Phantom stories every day contributed to me becoming a fan, and they opened up the road for me to become a superhero fan. There was something else that we had, which is not very well known in the United States, which is Monica's Gang. These are produced in Brazil by Brazilian author Mauricio de Souza, who has the largest studio producing ongoing comics in the world, even larger than the Disney studios. And although it does not produce the same amount of stories per month as Marvel does now, everybody works for the studio. They're employees. They don't produce runs. They make short stories, and they're all collected in anthologies like the Disney comics. If this somewhat looks like manga, it's because Mauricio de Souza was a very close friend of Tezuka, who created Astro Boy, and they ended up developing a style that was close. The characters here are also children, and all in getting into mischief, and there were a lot of regulars. They were called Monica's Gang because Monica was the most famous in the group. And she had a habit of beating up her friends. There were a few parallel lines that were also produced by Mauricio de Souza. This was a horror-themed strip. I don't know how to translate this. But you have all the typical monsters: a ghost, a vampire, a Frankenstein, and a wolfman. And these like Disney, they were also a part of my childhood, and I ended up not keeping the ones that I had, just like Disney. So because these comics appeared in the same ranks as superheroes, it was not difficult for me to switch to them. And we're talking mid 80s here, and the Brazilian publishers ran a variety of anthologies, all in digest size, and 3 or 4 stories per issue, about 80 pages of story. And I had the opportunity to meet a lot of different characters. And this is Star-Lord. for many years, Star-Lord was just an obscure character that I knew from this Chris Claremont, John Byrne story, and he appeared very little since. There were, and I remember that there were a couple of other stories that appeared in other titles, but mostly Star-Lord was forgotten. The publisher wanted to run everything that Claremont and Byrne produced together, which was a good call, I think. Byrne was one of the editor's favorites, and he ended up becoming one of everybody's favorites with X-Men and Fantastic Four, and then later with Superman. Byrne produced the best Marvel and DC stories of the 1980s. And I just love Star-Lord. But there was more. Here's Conan. Actually, this is not Conan. This is Star the Slayer. Conan appeared in his own magazine at the time, and I was buying Conan. This anthology in particular was very good because it had several rotating heroes. In this issue, for example, the Micronauts are introduced. But we also had the second Power Pack story. So it was a great chance to get to know a lot of superheroes and a lot of different features. Iron Man was a regular feature, so was Thor and the Avengers. The Cloak and Dagger miniseries ran here, started here. This was their origin story. Also, is Wonder Man returning in the Avengers. And the meeting of Power Man and Iron Fist. Once more, Claremont and Byrne. There's also one of my favorites, the Jim Starlin Howard Chaykin story that reveals the Infinity Formula with Nick Fury. I enjoyed this. Was always one of my favorites. The Avengers meet the Guardians of the Galaxy. I love this because it was George Ferris. I love George Ferris on the Avengers, and there were a lot of heroes on the cover, so I absolutely loved it. There are other stories here, more Micronauts, and also a What If starring Captain America. And Doctor Strange meeting Sergeant Fury. Great story by Roger Stern and Marshall Rogers. I want Marvel to reprint these in a full volume. I want to read all of them again in English, which I've never read, only in Portuguese. Here's a cute locally produced cover by Brazilian artist Watson Portela. The story features Thor. There's also part of the Korvac saga in here. And Iron Man, Demon in the Bottle, appeared here as well. This magazine would eventually be replaced by the X-Men, but before it happened, first appearance of Monica Rambeau, Captain Marvel, who to me is the real and the one and true Captain Marvel. And the story, this issue also begins the Walt Simonson run and introduces here on the second part of the Ballad of Beta Ray Bill. I absolutely love these. Walt Simonson was like nothing I had ever seen at the time. It was just amazing. And this Beta Ray character, he was also nothing like you'd expect. He turned out to become a very important partner in frame for Thor. Also begins the Machine Man miniseries by Tom DeFalco, Herb Trimpe, and Barry Windsor Smith. Here it is. This was actually my first introduction to Machine Man. I hadn't read either the Kirby or Ditko runs. And there's also Avengers now with Captain Marvel and the She-Hulk. Another anthology with rotating characters, Super Aventuras Marvel. So we had Frank Miller's Daredevil, X-Men, Claremont Cockrum and Claremont Byrne. There's also the Doctor Strange Dracula crossover in here. This was quite different from what I was used to when I was reading Disney. And then switching to Frank Miller, who did not almost did not bother with captions or even sometimes with sound effects. Here he has some, but they're rare. I mean, 2 pages of action and only half of the panels of sound effects. Part of the Dark Phoenix saga in here. Claremont and Byrne. They really wanted to run everything by Claremont and Byrne. So I have a friend of mine watching. Hello, Pedro Bossip. He's one of the friends that I want to bring in one of these days. We're going to talk about all of these 80s comics, which are the best. Here's another of that title, Alpha Fight on the cover, John Byrne once more. I love Puck. Absolutely. To me, he is still one of the best members of Alpha Flight. Of course, this issue also ran the famous fight between Snowbird and the Great Beast. So, where's the art? They didn't use the original coloring, so they actually colored all the panels in blue and yellow. So it's not the same effect, but when I saw this for the first time, what happened here? I thought something had gone wrong. There's a Marvel Twin one here with it was mostly a fill-in issue. And post Dark Phoenix X-Men with Cockrum back in the Earth. The Incredible Hulk was pretty amazing at the time. When I started reading, it was the Bill Mantlo Sal Buscema era. I want to do a special on Bill Mantlo one of these days. Let me see. Here's Jarella. This was the first meeting between Hulk and Jarella, which they published a bit outside of the continuity here. There were other stories in the Incredible Hulk. Here's a Marvel Twin one, which was part of the attempted resurrection of Adam Warlock. The entire Captain Marvel and Warlock battle against Thanos was run editorially by the Brazilians as a unified saga, and they even had their own name for it, the Thanos saga, which I thought was a pretty cool name. They later published it in the late 90s as a 5-volume set with all of the relevant stories. Not only the Thanos' appearances against Captain Marvel and Warlock, but also Adam Warlock's Origin, which at the time had never been run in Brazil. Also, part of the Hulk was Rom the Space Knight. So they ran Micronauts and ROM, which to us were an integral part of the Marvel Universe, and we can't live without them. And that's why we want Marvel to buy these characters. Although nowadays I don't want Marvel to buy anything. Another Hulk. The appearance of Berit from the Hulk Black and White magazine. Not a favorite character. Rick Jones being struck by gamma rays. Rick Jones always in a permanent feature. To me, he's inseparable from the Incredible Hulk. Doesn't matter what time in his career it is. And another ROM story. I'll get back to ROM in a little while. First, Captain America. This is issue number 43 from way back in 1982. That's right. This is part of the Corporation saga. That's Animus on the cover. Part of the SHIELD super agents that were being trained by the Falcon. Iron Man backup story. These stories before the Michelinie, Mantlo, Romita Jr. run, they're really not very good. Not exactly material that should appear in Iron Man. And there was a lot of things that didn't really have to do with technology or corporations, and they included a lot of horror elements which were out of place in Iron Man. Here's a John Byrne Iron Fist story. A couple of years later, this is issue number 60. Yeah, 60. So part of the Stern Byrne era had already ended. But Steve had already met Bernie Rosenthal here. I actually enjoyed Bernie Rosenthal. To me, it's a shame that it didn't work out between Steve and her. Ghost Rider also became a feature. There are issues against Roulette. And here's a Defender story. Great double-page spread by Sal Buscema. Amazing. So when I was reading all of these great artists, Frank Miller, Sal and John Buscema, John Byrne, Byrne also writing, Chris Claremont, David Michelinie, Bill Mantlo. It should be no surprise that I got hooked on comics with this. These were just the best. Captain America a few years later. This is also an original Watson Portela cover, made specifically for Brazil. Kind of looks like Frank Robbins. I just love Mike Zeck doing the art. There's a Spider-Man story here running as a filler. Special appearances by Turner D. Century and and Dominic Fortune. Too bad they didn't run the regular Dominic Fortune stories. They would have been interesting too. That's right. So this is where I knew Fortune from. Also, Moon Knight, an occasionally regular feature, but they didn't publish many stories after Bill Sienkiewicz left. Here's something that was regular that also appeared in these comics at the time, which if you sent in art, they would publish it. This was made. This was Daredevil by a reader. The letter. They also had letters, and they were as interesting as the American ones. Another anthology was Spider-Man, Death of the White Tiger. So I ended up knowing a lot of characters just by reading the stories in this format. When I first met Americans online, I was surprised to find out that many of them had gone their entire life, over 20 years of collecting, and then never picked up Spider-Man or had never picked up Captain America, but they would read the Avengers or they would read the Hulk, and I didn't understand why. I didn't have money to buy all of these that came out every month, but I would always switch magazines to figure out what was going on, and I could keep up with the characters. This is part of Roger Stern run in Amazing Spider-Man. Also pretty good run with art by, here it's Marie Severin, but John Romita Jr. was also handling art at the time. And here's the backup story that was run, the White Tiger backup story that ended up leading to his retirement. Spider-Man also had Ka-Zar backup stories. This was the Bruce Jones, Brent Anderson run. And the Fantastic Four would also run here, but at the time they were in the Hulk. First appearance of Captain Britain in the Brazilian comics. Because Spider-Man had several magazines, they could run a Marvel team up as fillers and occasionally run and then the next month they would run 3 stories from Amazing, and then they would run 2 from Spectacular. So it was a good way of switching. And the continuity was tight, so you didn't get lost. Also, first appearance of Arcade, and of course, Claremont and Byrne, which was mandatory. And more Ka-Zar. I like Ka-Zar better now than I did before. But I can show the Fantastic Four, but they ran the John Byrne stories. Now there was another title, which was a quarterly title made specifically for important stories, and this one as the confrontation between Iron Man and Doctor Doom in King Arthur's time. And finally, here's the Fantastic Four, the entire conflict between the Fantastic Four and the Sphinx, which also involved Galactus defeating the Sphinx. John Byrne art, but not written by him. So the uniforms still look like the traditional ones. Also the first appearance of T-Rex. Became a very important character later on. And this was Marvel. They also ran DC. They ran Camelot 3000 as a 4-issue miniseries. 3 regular American issues per comic. Camelot 3000 had original run in a comic that was translated as Super Friends, where they also published Atari Force and Warlord. So it was a good choice to run this. but they were a bit jumping between in the chronology before the Crisis on Infinite Earths. And before Crisis, the comic that was most interesting was, of course, the New Teen Titans. Let's see now, 11, 12. Okay. Here's the New Teen Titans, also, which allowed me to rediscover George Pérez. He was much better here than he was in the Avengers. Running a Batman backup story by Archie Goodwin and Jim Aparo as well. Also Green Lantern story run here. Yep. Tara joins the team. Great artwork on the inside. George Pérez was always a great storyteller. But at this time, they were running something different here. Here's something that I find very obscure, and it took me a while to find online what it was called in English, which was Baron Earth. The Baron Earth ran as a backup story in Warlord, and they should really collect this because this is very good. There's about 260 pages of material, and it could fit entirely in one volume. But the story goes unended after Conquer of the Baron Earth, especially because they weren't interested in running stories that were not set in the regular universe. Crisis on Infinite Earths was being run inside the regular comics. Several heroes meeting up. I think this was the first time that a lot of readers saw the Blue Beetle. And here it is, the origin of the Monitor. It made sense that they ran important issues of the Crisis inside the New Titans because Marv Wolfman and George Pérez were doing it. Here's the Vigilante. There are a few Vigilante stories, although this here he appears with the Titans. The Vigilante is supposed to be Hadrian Chase, and in the Arrow TV series, they fooled us. At the time, Robin was thinking about leaving the team. And finally, the debut of Nightwing and Jericho, plus the origin of Deathstroke the Terminator. This was a great story. It began here the Judas Contract, which is still one of the best in continuity DC stories ever. So getting rid of the Titans was a terrible idea by DC with the New 52, because these are very important. This is where the Titans who used to be the sidekicks where they finally grew up and gained their own personalities. So that's it for DC. I was never as much into DC as I was with as I was Marvel, but I read it as well. Years old. After a while, they also started running these really big magazines, really thick, 260 pages, and I mentioned they ran the Captain Marvel and Warlock Jim Starlin run as a unified Thanos saga, and they did the same with ROM. Eventually, it became a running theme through all of the magazines, which was the Dire Wraith War. So, but they run a bunch of stories here. There, first Spider-Man story. Fantastic Four accused of witchcraft when they were trying to have a secret identity. And finally, the Dire Wraith saga ended in these stories. And it didn't. The Dire Wraith storyline ended before the wrong title, but they didn't bother running any other story after it ended. Just as they had done with the Micronauts. The Micronauts ran for 59 issues in the United States, but they stopped publishing after number 12. And also, X-Men with the first appearance of James Proudstar, still called Thunderbird like his brother. This run by Claremont and Romita Jr. is also pretty good. Some people don't like it as much as the Bert Cockrum years, but I think the art is great at the time, and it really changed. It really allowed the X-Men to go into their own direction. And that's it for this time because I'm running a little I'm running a little long here, and it's almost 50 minutes. So this was the first part of my origin story, and I'm going to run the second part of my origin story tomorrow at the same time. So be here, and I will show you some of the um, more evolved comics that attracted me to becoming a regular reader beyond the normal magazines. So thank you very much for staying with me. I hope you enjoy taking a look at covers made for a different market and see how Marvel and DC are handled in another country. And this part is done. I'll talk to and I'll come back tomorrow and we'll continue this conversation. Thank you very much and keep reading old comics.